Not the real Annabelle doll. Some of you still believed it was, so I just want to come on here and say officially that this is not the real Annabelle doll, it's a replica.
Spirits, can you tell me, do you know more of these men?
Oh yes, they found some just a month ago.
That's right.
That's where the skeletons.
Her mouth opens up to such an impossible extent that the investigators believe that they might have captured a paranormal transfiguration.
Lord, protect us from any evil, inhuman, or demonic entities that may surround this or infuse in this doll.
A switch housed in a New Orleans museum is a reminder of the mysterious case of a man who was apparently raised from the dead. In 1962, a Haitian farmer checked into a hospital where he began coughing up redness. Doctors weren't super sure what was wrong with him, and his condition continued to worsen until he passed away 3 days after being admitted. His grief-stricken family buried him and mourned the sudden death with no obvious answers. But about 18 years later, in the year 1980, the man's sister was walking down a road when she spotted a disheveled man who claimed to be her brother. Obviously, she didn't believe him. She'd seen her brother die. She watched him be buried. But the man in front of her looked like her brother, told her things about when they grew up together, including his nickname for when they were really young. And the mystery deepened. How had he been raised from the dead? Her brother said he'd been given a voodoo potion that made him appear dead. And he'd actually been conscious but paralyzed during the entire time the family prepared for his funeral. After his death, he was dug up and forced into work on a sugar plantation, where he worked until the owner died and he could escape. Bela Lugosi reigned supreme as one of the world's most famous horror movie actors. However, did you know he actually had some personal interest in the occult? He was known to practice a form of clairvoyance that involved staring intensely at inanimate objects to receive messages from spirits. One of the objects of these clairvoyance exercises was a mirror that Bela Lugosi kept in his Hollywood Hills home. Bela's home was purchased by one Frank Selettri, who was killed in his home. Ooh, little cursed. Bela Lugosi's mirror is now housed in a museum of haunted items in Las Vegas, donated after the niece of Frank Selettri inherited said mirror. The niece claimed that paranormal activity increased in her home after obtaining the mirror, feeling bites on her neck, seeing dark silhouettes reflected in it. Can I steal the mirror? Kevin Manus bought a box at an estate sale in 2001 and immediately started having nightmares about an evil hag, and so did any friends that stayed with him. He decided, hey, I'm just gonna give this to my mom. She suffered a stroke, same day. After that, the box got passed on, and the later owners have also claimed that the Dibbuk, which is the spirit contained in the box, has appeared in their nightmares as well. The last known owner was Jason Haxton, director of the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine, who not only had nightmares, but developed a strange skin disease and began coughing up red fluids. At that point, Haxton contacted his local rabbis, sealed the spirit back in the box, and then hid it from the world with the help from a museum archivist friend. Don't go digging it up. If you find it, leave it in the ground. While the American South is renowned for its hospitality, it does have a dark history connected to plantation, superstition, and human exploitation. One very famous plantation was the Myrtle Plantation, with a rumored 10 deaths occurring in that household. And while the home itself is believed to be haunted, today we're talking about one particular artifact, the Plantation Mirror. Now, mirrors house their fair share of superstitions. Generally, you'd cover a mirror with a cloth after somebody's passed, but when somebody passed on this place, they forgot to cover this one up. And it is rumored that the uncovered mirror now holds the spirits of Sarah Woodruff and her 2 daughters. And while we think they died of yellow fever, legend has it, they were poisoned with cake. Dubbed the Devil's Rocking Chair, this chair is of unknown origin, but it belonged to the Glatzel family in the early 1950s. The horrors began in July of 1980 when David Glatzel was possessed by a demon. He would wake up screaming in the night, claiming he had been visited by a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features, jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, hooves, and everybody was like, okay, yep, nope. You're saying the truth, because David was not the kind of person who liked scary movies. He didn't like to make things up, and he was very visibly shaken by this. He became withdrawn, quiet. Desperate for help, the family called renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. They began making regular visits, bringing priests with them. They performed exorcisms, and a lot of these exorcisms took place while David was seated in the rocking chair. The chair itself moved about the house on its own. It was mysterious. It would disappear, reappear, move around the house. It would levitate, and folks saw it levitate, so we've got enough witnesses. One time in particular, it was the final exorcism when the demon left David, and he was like, okay, I'm getting better. But Arn Johnson, also present, was like, hey, get out of him, come into me. And He got possessed, he started making the same kind of growls and hisses that David had made, as well as slipping into trances for a period of months before killing his landlord. 8 months go by, Johnson appeared in a court with a plan to enter a plea of not guilty due to demonic possession, and for the first time in American legal history, this was used as a reason for killing somebody. Didn't work though, but for many years after the horrifying events, the rocking chair remained in storage. When the family later moved, it went with them, but over time they were like, yeah, something's wrong with that chair. Whoever sat in it, whether innocently or because they knew its strange history, was suddenly stricken with sciatica or abnormal back problems. Some folks even needed surgery. One close member was unable to walk upright more than 10 years after testing the legend of the chair. So be careful where you sit. No one could have known that a photograph that was taken of Bill Stoneham when he was in his youth would go on to become one of the most famous cursed paintings in history. So when he was young, he played with a little girl from the neighborhood, and one day his parents had, both of them pose in front of a glass door for a photo. Flash forward 1972, Bill's first wife, Roan, wrote a poem called Hands Resist 'Em. It was about Bill's experience of being adopted, never knowing his biological siblings, and at the time the couple lived in California. Bill was under contract with his art studio, where he had to produce 2 paintings each month, making $200 each, which we like. He was strapped for inspiration and was like, hey, I'll just paint that. Called the painting The Hands Resist 'Em, turned it over to Charles Feingarten for a large gallery show in 1974 with the accompanying poem, and at the show the painting was purchased by actor John Marley, most famous for his role as the movie producer in The Godfather, who wakes up with the horse's head in his bed. The gallery show also led to the painting's first press mention, when it was reviewed by noted art critic Henry Seldes. This is all important, I promise, because this is where things get strange. Between 1978 to 1984, 3 of the men closest to the painting died. Seldes in 1978, Feingarten in 81, and Marley in 84. The painting disappeared from public view after Marley's death, and it would be about 26 years before Bill heard about his painting again. It was in the year 2000. It resurfaced in a listing on eBay. The family selling it claimed that the boy and the doll in the painting were fighting. They were coming out of the painting at night, and these details proved to be a huge draw for online buyers. The listing was viewed more than 30,000 times, and some viewers even complained to the seller about experiencing supernatural occurrences after just looking at the listing. They claimed to hear voices in their homes. They became ill. Somebody blacked out. By the time the painting was sold to gallery owner Kim Smith for over $1,000, its legend had spread across the internet. The Stagecraft painting is an adaptation of another photograph. This was taken by commercial photographer James Kidd. And the photo was taken of a wooden cart and the figure of a man without a head, and it was only really found after the picture was developed. There was no evidence of it being tampered with. The artist who painted the painting was drawn to the photograph and just felt like she had to. Her oil painting of the photograph was hung in her home, and that's where things get ooky spooky. She claims it was responsible for a mysterious leak, objects being knocked over, broken items, even mysterious knocks on doors. Laura's had many offers to buy the painting, but she doesn't really want to inflict that on anybody else. The seemingly sweet painting of Samantha Houston has a dark story behind it. Samantha is believed to be the daughter of a senator in Texas, and her father brought her to stay at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin with him in 1887, where she unfortunately fell down the stairs while playing with her ball, and since then her ghost is said to haunt the Driscoll where she died. Her painting, completed by one Richard King, was hung in the hotel where she passed away and has focused the spirit's alleged activity. A bouncing ball can often be seen in the hotel lobby, door handles beside the painting rattle, and her expression seems to distort as guests view the painting. Also, some folks feel nauseous around it, they feel a falling feeling. I'm just not going to make eye contact. It's hard to get more iconic than James Dean and his silver sports car. Porsche 550 Spider cars were some of the fastest cars at the time of being manufactured, but they were also notoriously temperamental. They'd crumple like an aluminum can in a crash. And sadly, that's what happened to James Dean on his way to a car race in 1955. The car was auctioned and sold in parts, but owners of these auto pieces have reported fires, car crashes, mysterious injuries, the whole kit and caboodle. What was left of the car still toured and had its fair share of mishaps along the way. However, after an exhibition in Miami, the towing van and the car disappeared in 1960. In the chilling case of the Peron family, their seemingly serene farmhouse in Rhode Island concealed a dark and malevolent secret. Soon after moving in, there was strange stuff going on. At first, they kind of wrote it off. They're like, okay, weird stuff. Brooms were moving on their own. People were seeing apparitions. Carolyn Peron, determined to uncover the truth, delved into the history of the house and discovered a whole lineage plagued by mysterious and tragic deaths spanning 8 generations. The most ominous presence was that of Bathsheba Sherman, a woman associated with witchcraft. Bathsheba's malevolent intentions became kind of evident as the family's life was spiraling into a nightmare. There was one incident where Carolyn had a really weird wound on her calf that resembled something you would like sew with. And this was just one of many episodes endured by the Peron family over their decade-long time living in the house. Who'd they call in? Ed and Lorraine Warren. They're like, oh yeah, there's something going on here. They identified a cursed artifact, a mysterious box. They believed it acted as a conduit for Bathsheba's demonic energy in the household. So when they were like, okay, we're gonna fix this, they performed blessings, grabbed the box, and got the heck out of there. The evils perpetrated by notorious New Orleans slave owner Delphine Lalaurie have been discussed many times, quite rightly singling her out as one of history's most evil women. It is no surprise then that the unspeakable crimes she committed have catapulted her into the realms of dark folklore and urban legend. In the 1990s, the residents of an apartment building, which stands on the spot that Lalaurie's infamous Chamber of Horrors once stood, decided to pool their assets and brighten up the communal spaces with some nice new artwork. What better way could there be to achieve this goal than to commission local artist Ricardo Pustiano to paint them a portrait of a notable local celebrity. Who could this be? Let's think. Louis Armstrong, DJ Khaled? Nope, they chose a lovely cheery portrait of Madame Delphine Lalaurie. And once you know it, it was haunted. Cue a series of bone-chilling encounters with the ghost of Lalaurie, culminating in the portrait being taken down, covered up, and stored away securely. I just hope somebody had the common sense to burn it. Charles Manson was sentenced to death following his conviction in 1971, though California outlawed the death penalty in 1972, thus reducing his sentence to life in prison. So a lot of folks assumed his cult was going to fall apart after he was imprisoned, but he managed to lead his followers while still incarcerated. Some people believe that Manson had a demonic influence and that the letters and objects he mailed from Pelican Bay State Prison were cursed. It is thought that Manson used electrical thought impressions on a television that he then mailed to a Texas grad student so he could manipulate him from afar. The student was tormented by hallucinations and hauntings while he owned Manson's TV. Now this TV eventually fell into the hands of a man named Nick, who purchased a car from the grad student around 2012. The TV and some papers were in said car, and Nick immediately noticed a shift after the cursed television entered his life. He was out of work for 4 months, and his mother fell ill and died. A motorcycle accident claimed the life of another man who died on Nick's driveway. The self-proclaimed skeptic couldn't help but notice the correlation between the horrifying events and the TV's presence. In an attempt to rid himself of the negative energy, he shipped the TV to a friend. Immediately, his luck got better. Guess he didn't like this friend. Once placed in a statue of Sita in India, the Hope Diamond was stolen from its natural home by one thief named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. Within days of the thief fleeing from the site, however, he was ravaged by wolves in Russia and died. Sometime later, the stone made its way to the crown of King Louis XIV, who later died of gangrene. Other famous owners of the stone have followed similarly grisly fates, being, well, off with the head and publicly killed. I'd be here all day if I went through all 21 plus owners and their fates. Heck, even people who just tried on the necklace met some really weird ends. A temporary wearer, the Princesse de la Belle, was torn to pieces by a French mob. It's currently on display at the Smithsonian, but I think it should be hidden from public viewing. In 1972, Kerry Walton returned to his Australian hometown for his grandmother's funeral, and during that time, he decided to face a fear that he's had his entire life by visiting an abandoned building that had scared him for years. And when he got to this house, he discovered an old marionette underneath the porch. He felt compelled to take it home with him, and they were together forever after. According to psychics, the doll was made 200 years ago by a Romanian traveler for his son who had passed away. The doll has real human hair, and underneath the scalp is a likeness of a human brain. He was given the name Leta due to his heritage, and also because the doll occasionally screams, "Let me out." Now this doll's kinda quirky, so if you take him outside, it's gonna rain, and if he's entering a room, there's artwork on the wall, that's probably gonna fall off and go crash boom bang. Dogs are gonna bark, which dogs are perceptible to haunted things, and people have said they feel inexplicably afraid and sad whenever they see him. This doll is also supposedly capable of moving on his own, changing positions when seated, and emitting a pulse when held. An ancient oak tree near the village of Elton, Staffordshire, England, is undoubtedly one of the scariest looking trees you'll ever look at. Covered in huge rusted chains, it looks as though the tree may have once roamed around the forest, picking off wanderers who dare disturb its realm before the villagers captured it and chained it to his current spot. Legend has it that the Earl of Shrewsbury, who lived at the grand estate of Elton Towers, was traveling back home one evening when his carriage was stopped by a lone beggar woman. The grubby old lady asked the Earl for a penny, and when he rudely dismissed her, cursed the Earl, stating that for every branch that fell from the old oak tree, a member of his family family would perish. That night, a great storm ripped one of the limbs from the tree, and by morning, one of the Earl's family members had passed away horribly. The frightened nobleman then ordered that the oak be bound in chains so that no more branches could fall. Hello, Beauty and the Beast. A bizarre, possibly supernaturally influenced death takes place on a college campus. What would you expect the victim note to say? Maybe, the voices told me to do it. The devil made me do it. Well, what about the polar bears made me do it? This cursed painting, painted in 1864 by Edwin Henry Landseer, is often hidden from view by faculty at Royal Holloway, the University of London, in order for superstitious students to complete their exams. One tradition holds that anybody sitting directly in a sightline with the painting, they're gonna fail. Another legend states that one unlucky student locked eyes with one of the ravenous polar bears, went mad, and took their life after scrawling the phrase, "The polar bears made me do it," over and over and over again on their exam paper. The Conjuring Chest is a chest of drawers with a body count of about 16. As the story goes, a man named Remus custom made the item for his owner, Jeremiah Graham, in Kentucky around 1830. Graham, displeased with Remus's work, sent him to his deathbed. Remus's friends then cursed the chest by scattering dried owl redness in its drawers. The oblivious Grahams filled those drawers with clothes for their new son, who died soon after. For the next 140 years or so, the chest was passed down through the family, and death or injury came to anybody who stored their apparel inside. In the mid-20th century, Virginia Carey Hudson Cleveland watched her firstborn die, and another descendant contracted polio. A son got impaled at school, and the husband of one of her offspring died after being rushed to the hospital for appendicitis. A neighbor died after an accidental mishap, and all of them had used the chest. So, Cleveland enlisted the help of her maid, Sally, to undo the curse. They followed steps that included procuring a dead owl and boiling willow leaves. Sally said that if she or Virginia then died, it would prove that the curse had broken, and months later, Sally did die. When Virginia's daughter inherited the chest, she wisely opted not to use it, and in 1976, she donated it to the Kentucky Historical Society, where it resides today. Originally belonging to a 45-year-old New Jersey man named Oliver Birnbaum, the Conjuring Mirror was used to practice a medieval ritual known as speculum, or mirror magic. Not related to the chest I just talked about, but intriguing. He performed a lengthy incantation ritual known as a conjuring formula, inviting the spirit world to assist him in manipulating the future. When he was starting what he was doing, Oliver didn't see a lot in the mirror, just the movement of blurred forms. Quick little incidents that meant nothing to him. But the more he worked on it, the more he concentrated, the more control he got, the more he could see. He gained the ability to project people he didn't like into the mirror, singling them out for punishment or revenge. And while this might sound like a fun projection of somebody's imagination, these malicious acts would actually be carried out by inhuman spirits. In order to make a victim fall down the stairs, you'd have a spirit just like disorient them, grease a step, or even just give them a push. Eventually, Oliver got greedy and neglected the part of the ritual where he had to give homage to Satan. And as a result, all the evil that he wanted for others, it happened to him, and all those spirits now infested his home. After about a week of torment, this man was so terrified that he called a Catholic official and begged him to send a demonologist to his house. Who got sent? The Warrens, our favorite people. They showed up, and it was chaos. Doors were opening and closing by themselves. Something would crash and break every minute. Things would bounce off the walls, smash. Ed Warren was able to reverse the ritual, originally enacted by Oliver, bless the house, stopped it, and Oliver begged them to take the mirror with them. And they did. In 1991, hikers found a mummified body protruding from a glacier in the Alps, which straddled the border of Austria and Italy. And it was a middle-aged man that went the way of an arrow about 5,000 years ago. He started being called Otzi the Iceman, and he rocked the world of prehistoric research. Well, 14 years after the discovery, Australian molecular archaeologist Thomas Sloy died at age 63 of natural causes. He had been studying the Iceman closely, and it was him who actually found redness on the body from several other people. And it was like, intriguing. Now, to some people, this connection was just like kind of unremarkable, but to others, it's like, oh, we got a curse. Turns out the trouble with the Iceman began the year after he was discovered, when 64-year-old forensic pathologist Rainer Henn perished in a car accident. He was actually en route to give a lecture about the Iceman. Not long after that, mountain climber Kurt Fritz died in an avalanche. He had arranged the helicopter trip to retrieve the Iceman from the mountain. Then you've got Rainer Holtz, who captured footage of the retrieval, passed away from a brain tumor. Then you've got 3 other lives lost pretty quickly between 2004 to 2005. Kinda weird. And finally for today, have you heard the legend of Sleepy Hollow? No, not the Ming one. The one about the bronze lady, who's actually a lot easier to find than the Headless Horseman. She's a statue located in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and officially named Recueillement, or Grief. Bronze Lady was commissioned by the widow of Civil War General Samuel M. Thomas after he passed away in 1903. Now the widow was unhappy with the statue because its expression seemed too sad, so then sculptor Andrew O'Connor Jr. redid it. But instead of handing over the new head, he called it a monstrosity and shattered it in front of her. Well, the disgruntled Mrs. Thomas installed the original figure to watch over her late husband's tomb anyways. And then as years went on, a lot of people heard a lot of sobs coming from the bronze ladies, who grew up in the area, said if you knocked on the door of the general's tomb and looked through the keyhole, you were gonna have a bad dream that night. And then if you slapped the bronze lady, which why would you do that, she would haunt you for the rest of your life.
First, of course, is the Black Plague. The most famous and devastating plague in history, the Black Plague, or Yersinia pestis, utterly devastated the population of Europe. It wiped out half the population of Eurasia in the span of just 4 years. That is hundreds of millions. It's suspected the Golden Horde actually brought the disease to Europe, and by that point, it was far too late. The filthy living conditions lent themselves to not only infection, but fleas as well, and it's these flea bites that primarily spread the epidemic. Yersinia pestis can infect either through open sores and wounds, or through inhalation. If you breathe it in, it's called pneumonic plague, and if you get it through a lesion or sore, it's the bubonic plague. They manifest slightly differently, with pneumonic affecting the lungs heavily, while bubonic is most recognizable for attacking the lymphatic system, leading to swollen and painful glands in the armpits and elsewhere, eventually leading to septicemia and rot taking the person. Over these 6 different bubonic plagues, between 57 and 168 million people lost their lives, with the most recent outbreak lasting until 1960. Next is dysentery. Known as the flux, dysentery is one of the most common and pervasive diseases in human history. Now, you'd think it's common sense to not have your waste products go into, say, your drinking water and food, but for most of human history that was not common knowledge. Dysentery causes severe diarrhea, which in severe cases can cause fatalities through dehydration. Basically everyone had dysentery though. It's a fairly survivable disease if it doesn't get too bad and you get enough fluids, and it's thought most people would experience dysentery at some point in their lives. It was even worse for armies on the march, however. Turns out going camping with 30,000 of your best buds is not exactly hygienic and is a great way to spread dysentery. Dysentery is to this day often known as the soldier's sickness, as soldiers even in modern times on the move through hostile territory are likely to not have safe sources of food and drinking water, not to mention their close proximity to injury and disease. Next is cholera. The big sister of dysentery, cholera is significantly more dangerous and lethal. While dysentery is common amongst armies, cholera was the destroyer of cities. Though the red diarrhea of dysentery is disturbing and dangerous, cholera can prove lethal in just hours. Once contracted, cholera causes a purge of your body through every end. The infected lose so much water from these purges that they can perish just hours after symptoms begin. Symptoms can also be so severe that even constantly drinking water will not keep you hydrated. Even worse is that cholera is most often contracted through contact with contaminated water, meaning there likely isn't enough clean water available to treat the sick. Despite its horrific nature and ability to wipe out entire communities when a single well gets infected, cholera is also responsible for our discovery of germ theory, as it was discovered to be connected to infected water. Next is leprosy. Leprosy is one of the most famous biblical diseases and was widespread and seriously infectious, especially because people's skin was so filthy. They rarely washed and did so without soap in cold water, which does little to eliminate bacteria on the skin. This led to horrific lesions and infections in all classes, from the rich to poor, and also allowed leprosy a place to fester. Leprosy primarily causes a deadening of nerves, but can also damage the respiratory tract, the skin, and eyes. Most often, individuals with leprosy will not feel their injuries, infections, and other damage done to their bodies, which is why lepers are often depicted as missing digits or limbs. At least lepers could go straight to heaven, as they were already considered to be living in purgatory. Next is typhoid. Typhoid was another disease commonly associated with soldiers, and was even known as camp fever. Again, with the poop, typhoid is carried by humans and is spread by contact with infected human feces carrying the Salmonella enterica bacterium. During the siege of Antioch in 1098, the Crusader camp was ravaged by typhoid, which without antibiotics is highly dangerous. This wasn't the only time either. Typhoid begins with a low fever that steadily gets worse day by day, followed by muscle fatigue, severe head and body aches, severe weight loss, and more. Before antibiotics, typhoid was usually highly lethal, as unless the individual's immune system could fight it off, they had no hope of recovery. Even among those who recover though, typhoid continues to be a threat. They will shed typhoid bacteria for weeks afterwards, and around 1 in 10 survivors will carry the bacteria and spread it for the rest of their life. It's probably best that it was so lethal, as that likely prevented it from spreading as severely as other diseases. Next is the flu. The common flu may seem like little more than a seasonal nuisance to us now, but before modern science-based medicine, it was a massive threat. In 1557, influenza broke out and spread across the entire world. Beginning in Asia, it was brought over trade routes into Europe, Africa, and even the Americas. The disease was devastating, but the toll is unknown, as it spread so far and so fast that it outstripped whatever 16th century reporting methods there were. This was, however, the first time that numerous governments began to bring physicians in to dictate bureaucracy and policy around the control of epidemics, which opened the door for far more meaningful changes in medicine to be made. Influenza got so bad, though, that numerous governments and states were forced to essentially shut down, closing their courts and parliaments to prevent the spread. Next is scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, or scarlatina, is primarily a disease contracted by the very young and very old, and as such was a real scourge of the pre-antibiotic days. Diseases with its symptoms were described as early as Hippocrates himself in the BC 400s. It was highly lethal without strong medical attention, and even then it could often not be controlled. Scarlet fever is brought on by exposure to the bacteria, but can also come from any regular strep throat infection. Today, we don't even think of it as a danger. It's a very, very simple series of antibiotics that quickly destroy the bacteria. But even as little as a few decades ago, it was a horrific danger. My Nana, for instance, lost friends in elementary school to scarlet fever. Next is syphilis. If people couldn't tell that drinking poop water was a bad idea, how in the world would they have known about STDs? Well, they sort of did. I mean, how many times can you get itchy after the horizontal mambo and not realize how it happened? But also, the full extent of the disease was truly not known. 2 to 6 weeks after initial contact, a lesion or multiple lesions will form at the infection site, usually in the private areas. This lesion is what spreads the disease and is simply filled with infectious spirochetes. These lesions will get worse without treatment, but after 4 to 10 weeks, secondary syphilis sets in. This involves the spread of rashes that can also become papular or pustular, with multiple lesions in close proximity. This is painful, infectious, and embarrassing. Fever, weight loss, and hair loss are also possible symptoms, but if still left untreated, syphilis will progress to tertiary. This can involve severe brain damage or neurosyphilis, heart damage or cardiovascular syphilis, and perhaps the most recognizable is gomatosyphilis, where it causes the growth of numerous soft, fleshy tumors on multiple parts of the body. Thankfully, today, syphilis is very easily treated with antibiotics. Next is smallpox. One of the most horrifying diseases of the pre-modern era, smallpox is not only incredibly infectious and highly lethal, but is also disfiguring and horrifying in its impacts on the body. This is not cholera or dysentery, where everything is happening inside the body. Smallpox, even if survived, causes long-lasting physical external impacts. The very first immunization techniques developed in ancient China were actually to protect against smallpox, and even though that was basically just intentionally infecting people, it was the first of many steps to proper immunization. But smallpox was, perhaps most famously, used as a biological weapon against the American indigenous people. Most Europeans had already had generations of contact, and like chickenpox, once you've survived it once, you're much more likely to survive or simply never get it again. But the American tribes, who lived in less squalor and lower densities, had not built up this resistance over decades of disease. Smallpox had a near total fatality rate, and its intentional introduction through infected blankets and other items ensured that it spread deeply and widely through indigenous communities. On a slightly lighter note though, it is the only disease to be eradicated, with the last case in the wild occurring in 1977. And finally is diphtheria. Diphtheria can be tracked back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians, however wouldn't become widespread in Europe until the 1700s. Likely due to urbanization, poor hygiene, and close contact with the infected, it became a scourge, targeting the young primarily and ending thousands of lives. One of the most horrifying aspects is that as the disease destroys your body, a gray pseudomembrane begins to grow in the lungs and throat. This can become hard and rock-like and can even block airways. It's made of all of the destroyed cells your body is trying to get rid of, which in severe cases can lead to severe difficulty breathing and a horrific cough known as croup. It also causes lesions of infection on the body and can lead to heart disease and the destruction of neurons and nerves in the brain. It was one of the first successful vaccinations, however, with the first one being developed in 1890.
First up is capture. No soldier ever wanted to fall into the hands of their enemies. This was a constant threat and a major risk that Allied forces faced every day as they pushed on against the opposition. While they were deep in the heart of battle, they were well aware that their fortunes could change at any given moment. If a squad was caught off guard, they could easily fall into a trap and be captured by the very enemies they were fighting against. On many occasions, this was often worse than death. There really were no rules during the Second World War, so there was no telling what could happen to a soldier who was captured by the Axis. They could be placed in prison or concentration camps and could be used for some very dangerous activities. Pretty much every POW camp had terrible standards of living conditions, and no one was treated like a human being. These were places that every soldier wanted to avoid. The idea of being captured and sent here was constantly living in the backs of soldiers' minds. Next up is illness. Getting sick during the Second World War was not a very comfortable process. The world of medicine was nowhere near as advanced as it is today, so there were hardly any effective treatments for many deadly illnesses. And because soldiers were spending so much time out in the field in harsh conditions, they were always very prone to contracting a virus. Even a simple cold that was caught after spending days outside in the rain and the mud could evolve into some very deadly illnesses. Dysentery, malaria, and hepatitis were just some of the terrible diseases that a soldier could end up with while they were working in the field, and it was incredibly hard to treat any of these. Everyone was vulnerable to these terrible health problems while they were working in harsh conditions, so falling ill was something that everyone feared during World War II. Aside from the fact that you were fighting for your life on the battlefield, you also had to make sure that you were staying healthy in some of the worst environments imaginable. A trip to the hospital during World War II was never a good time. After that, we have sarin gas. One thing that could easily lead to a terrible health condition was sarin gas. There were so many terrifying weapons and heavy artillery that could do some serious damage, but there is an even scarier weapon that existed which couldn't be seen with the human eye. Sarin is truly one of the worst biological weapons that has ever been created. It's one of the scariest things that existed during World War II. The deadly mixture is considered a nerve agent because it is extremely toxic and directly attacks a person's central nervous system. Exposure to this colorless and tasteless gas can quickly interfere with the nerves that transfer messages to your vital organs. Antidotes were the only thing that could stop the spread of the gas if it was caught quickly. It was almost impossible to fight against something that you couldn't see. Now, because it was so deadly and dangerous, many leaders were very reluctant to use it. Even Germany's notorious leader at the time refused to use sarin gas against the Allied forces, which should really tell you something. Next up are airstrikes. Fighting an army on the ground was one thing, but trying to defend yourself from an overhead attack was a totally different ballgame. World War II soldiers were constantly living with the fear of bombers flying overhead and unleashing a terrible attack that they couldn't defend against. It didn't matter if you were on the battlefield or stationed in your own safe zone, an air raid could occur at any given moment. Even civilians who were resting in their homes had to be on high alert for these scary attacks that could happen at any given time. Now, of course, there were Allied planes that could defend against airstrikes in the air, but that didn't always work out. Ground units also had access to anti-aircraft artillery, but that only worked if you spotted the plane long before it arrived. Air raids were a deadly attack that could easily catch even the best of soldiers off guard. Flying a bomber behind enemy lines was a terrifying way to send a message, and it's something that soldiers had to be watching for every second of the day. Next up, we have spies. These specialty units had extremely dangerous jobs, but they were still feared by many during World War II. Spies were usually tasked with infiltrating the enemy's camp and leaking secrets back to their leaders. These special forces were masters of deception, and they were able to fool some of the smartest soldiers in the land. Allied troops had to be on high alert for any enemies in disguise who were trying to infiltrate their battalions. These spies would come up with all sorts of clever ways to try and get exactly what they wanted. While they would sometimes just keep their distance from afar, they could also dress up like a normal civilian and pretend to be in danger so they could get help from the Allied troops. If a spy was able to gain any information from their enemies through the use of their clever tactics, it could spell a terrible danger for the Allies. This could easily expose them to traps and ruin their future attack plans if an enemy was able to gain access to all of their top secret information. It's pretty obvious why everyone would have been on high alert for spies during World War II. Now we have the perception of others. This might not seem like a big fear in the grand scheme of things, but this state of mind could lead to some terrible decision making. There were many different reasons why people were going to war in the late 30s and early 40s, but sometimes people just felt pressured into doing something they didn't want to do. Turns out that 36% of untried soldiers were actually more afraid of being considered a coward than they were of being disfigured in battle. This is a pretty alarming stat because it means that some soldiers might have run into some terrible situations just because they didn't want to look weak in front of others. Now, obviously you were fighting for your country and the free world. There are some soldiers who ran into situations they knew they would never make it out of. These decisions that were based on not looking like a coward could have exposed the rest of a squad or allowed the enemies to gain an advantage and wipe out an entire unit. It was very important to keep everybody in check and make sure they were following orders without stepping out of line to look good in front of everybody else. Next on our list is mental trauma. Speaking on the topic of the right state of mind, many soldiers unfortunately had to deal with terrible trauma due to all of the terrible casualties they witnessed every single day. These soldiers fought in some of the deadliest conditions imaginable. They were left with some of the worst memories a person could ever imagine. These images that played in their heads beds every single day took a serious mental toll on them. There was absolutely no way of dealing with it. They still had to wake up every single morning and get right back into the fight. This post-traumatic stress was seriously hurting their abilities in battle. Carrying out such dangerous tasks while living with PTSD is nearly impossible. This would often put soldiers in extremely vulnerable conditions. Any hesitation on the battlefield could cost a person their life. Living with these awful memories was something that every soldier feared during World War II. Even if a soldier made it through to the end of the war, they would still be stuck with these terrible flashbacks for the rest of their lives. After that, we have the sounds of charging. There are many sounds that soldiers feared during World War II. Anything from the battlefield could be considered the worst sound of them all. Perhaps the scariest of the bunch was the sound of a charging battalion. If soldiers weren't expecting an attack to take place and heard the sounds of their enemies approaching in numbers, it could be game over. Recon units and spies were usually very good at detecting an enemy attack that was going to take place. There were some occasions where the Allies were caught off guard. There was no telling what kind of damage the enemies might be able to inflict or what their goals were. The sound of charging forces was absolutely terrifying. Even if you knew the attack was coming and were prepared for it, there's no way a soldier wouldn't be a little bit terrified by a mob of aggressive soldiers heading in their direction. These charging attacks were some of the deadliest during World War II and would usually lead to fierce battles that could last for days. This was just another terrible circumstance that every soldier feared during the Second World War. Now we have injuries. There's no way of sugarcoating it. Many soldiers who went into battle during World War II weren't going to make it home. Many others were going to sustain life-altering injuries. There was no telling what was going to happen to the brave soldiers once they set foot onto the battlefield. There was no guarantee they were ever going to make it out alive. Every soldier was well aware of the circumstances and what could have happened to them. They still went into battle without hesitation. The main problem, however, was that if you did sustain a terrible injury, it would often be extremely painful to fix it. Much like the problems they had with treating illnesses, medicine in the 30s and 40s just wasn't up to snuff. Many injuries sadly resulted in amputations, and the surgeries were absolutely brutal. While some people would try their best to keep these thoughts out of their head, it's nearly impossible to not think about this risk in some capacity. These terrible consequences of war were on everyone's mind 24/7. And now we have sleeping. Yes, as strange as it might sound at first, sleep was not a simple getaway for soldiers during World War II. It should have been the perfect time to rest up and forget about everything that was going on around you, but that was rarely ever the case. For many soldiers, they view this as a time when your guards were down and you were vulnerable to every kind of attack. Enemies could easily catch the Allied forces off guard in the middle of the night and plot some of their deadliest attacks while everyone was resting in their beds. Of course, there were guards who were keeping an eye on the perimeter, but it ought to be far too late once they noticed that enemy troops were approaching. On top of a physical attack taking place, soldiers would also be faced with terrible nightmares of all the traumas they had just experienced in battle. This would obviously play a huge part in a negative mental state and could seriously harm the strength of a battalion. Sleeping wasn't always the relaxing break we all crave during these trying times.
I'm kicking off today with a doll that belongs to a very good friend of mine, Mysterion the Mind Reader. Now, his name in classic doll fashion comes from his original owner, Walter Tomlinson, born allegedly in 1927, and he liked to start fires in the doll's presence, and that's how Walt the doll got his hunger and love of the flames. This was the one toy Walter didn't destroy, and spent his days with little human contact because he was suffering from violent outbursts. As punishment for attacking a housekeeper, the doll was taken from him, and in retaliation he set fire to his house. Thankfully nobody was hurt, but at that point he was sent to a state sanitarium, and he passed away sadly there. For context, by the way, Mysterion, the current caretaker of the doll, his home is already haunted by a number of ghosties, so I don't think that helps with Walt's general chaos, because this doll enjoys tormenting animals, setting fires, and communicating through his little bell. I believe we actually have footage of him setting a fire at a live seance, and trust me, that was real. I know when things are faked. That wasn't it. The last 3 owners before Mysterion that took possession of Walt sadly all wound up being victims of mysterious house fires. And also, fun little side fact, there is a lock of hair buried in his head that Mysterion believes came from the original owner, but nobody's cracked it open to know for sure. The story of Iki Ningyo all began with Junji Inagawa, a multi-talented artist deeply involved in traditional Japanese plays, and stumbled upon a peculiar incident one night. There was a radio broadcast on, and there was a distressed crew member who claimed to have heard the voice of a fan who had passed away many months ago, sending shivers down everybody's spines. Inagawa, no stranger to the mysteries of the supernatural, encountered something inexplicable on the way home. A younger girl in a red kimono. Seemingly, a normal girl, until she defied gravity and approached him, unseen by others. As he delved into a new theatrical project featuring a doll, he was horrified to discover that the doll bore a striking resemblance to the levitating girl from that fateful night. The eerie incidents that followed seemed like a series of ominous messages from the other side. The artisan who crafted the doll vanished, a scriptwriter's house was mysteriously consumed by flames, and accidents plagued the rehearsals. Perhaps the most unsettling of all were the injuries that specifically targeted the right hand and right knee of crew members. Alrighty folks, allow me to tell the wonky tale of how a ballerina ragdoll came to be in my possession. To set the scene, picture smaller Alexa, probably dressed in something pink, wandering around an arts and crafts market in a college gym. And at one booth in particular, I spotted this gorgeous ragdoll in a pink dress. And I was like, hey mom, Christmas is coming, I want her. Fast forward to Christmas morning, I'm unwrapping my gifts, and one of the beautiful packages under the tree, I open it, and it's a ragdoll with short, stringy red hair and a blue dress. Now, I'm sure you can be like, okay, what's the problem here? The doll I wanted was pink, this one was blue, and while I tried to appear grateful, I didn't really love blue at the time, so it was very obvious. My mom reached out to the lady she got the doll from. Turns out there was a mix-up, but the doll in the pink dress I'd fallen in love with, no longer available. But she's like, hey, if you want to exchange it, sure. So I found a purple doll and wound up with this beauty with a nose that looks like a mouth and a tiny little mouth, and she's got the gangly arms and legs. She found her home on a bright yellow rocking chair that lived in a corner of my bedroom for many, many years. And when I left home to go to university, she stayed behind for reasons. And during my second year of university, my dad was sleeping in my old bedroom, and he was so creeped out by her that she found a new home, the closet. Nowadays, she lives in the living room of my apartment because while I can't find it in me to pass her on to somebody or burn the thing, she has an energy that cannot just be ignored, and I'm already prone to nightmares. I don't need any more bad mojo. The Okiku doll was bought in Sapporo by Eikichi Suzuki in 1918 for his sister Okiku. She played with this doll every day. She took it everywhere. She would talk with it. She eventually called the doll like her name because she considered it a duplicate of herself. It never left her sight. Sadly, a year later, in 1919, tragedy struck. Poor Okiku passed away from yellow fever while she was holding the doll firmly in her grasp. After her passing, the doll was placed in the family's altar, and that's when the weirdness started to occur. One day, the family started to notice that the doll's hair was getting longer. Once a traditional shoulder-length cut with neat ends, now a mangled mess of split ends reaching past down her waist. It was scruffy, different colors, felt different. At night, the family would dream of Okiku. Sometimes the doll would appear by their side come morning. The chilling events intensified into full-blown acts of spiritual manifestation. We're talking lights flickering on and off, bangings in the house, strange voices, the whole shebang. Yvonne Hydes is an events manager for the Scottish Ghost Company and has organized paranormal investigations for many, many years. And during one event at Easter House's Proven Hall, she received an old-looking doll from one of the members. Her friend David, who is a certified medium, absolutely hates the doll because the moment she brought the doll home and he was there, he was like, no, keep that in the garage, it's making me feel uneasy. Then her dog took a dislike to the doll being in the room. It was barking, it was shaking, and when the caretaker of the doll was telling people about the doll, it was almost as if the doll could hear her. So the ghost company took the doll to a park to investigate things further. They did a live stream, they tied a red light around her with the hopes of allowing the spirit to transfigure its face onto the doll, and during the process, Yvonne and a couple of other folks were like, yo, the doll blinked, and then they were like, hey, do we want to bury it? Do we want to keep it? They decided to keep it. I wish them luck. A husband and wife believe their Raggedy Ann doll is possessed after a series of terrifying events unfolded. When Lindsay and Lee's doll first arrived in the Museum of Haunted Objects, Lindsay and one of her close friends got mysterious illnesses and nearly avoided 2 car crashes. Lindsay's like, yeah, I just became really ill for some reason. I was in the hospital for a week. The doctors didn't know what was wrong. And then her other friend got really ill, like we're talking abscesses, like all sorts of stuff. On the 2-year anniversary of the couple owning the doll struck again. The heavy Ouija table that they had, which questionable, was hurled over, and that was caught on camera. And then they were like, oh, let's put it in a glass cupboard on a secure hook. The doll got out. I'm like, I don't know, maybe this is a doll that should be burned. Kathy Gallagher said that since moving into her home back in August of 2018, she's experienced a whole series of scary supernatural incidents. We're talking objects moving on their own, shadow figures in the darkness. She was most stunned, I think, when a camera she'd set up in her basement captured a black mass emerging from her mother's old doll from the 1950s. And she doesn't know what it could be. So footage captured showed her cat, Salem, visibly distressed and staring intently at the doll before what appears to be black mist appearing from one of the dolls and drifts in the kitty's direction, sending the poor little kitty bolting for its life. The footage is so freaky that folks online were like, okay, you digitally altered this, you did something. And the family's like, no, like we're debunking this, like this is real, we just want to know what the heck is going on. Robert the doll originally belonged to Robert Eugene Otto, a very eccentric artist, but what great artists aren't? Neighbors of Robert used to hear him having a conversation with the doll, and we're talking this is like when he was a grown-up, but you do you, pal. He brought it everywhere. He talked about it in the first person as if it weren't a doll. And this doll remained stored in the Otto family home until Robert passed in 1974. After his death, a couple bought the house, and their daughter found the doll in the attic, and she claimed the doll was trying to kill her. So obviously the doll is now on display in a museum and is still believed to curse people. His last caretaker before the museum experienced him disappear and reappear as he pleased. They heard footsteps, they heard giggling. Some folks claim that Robert's expression changes whenever anybody badmouths his previous owner in his presence. Allegedly he's been responsible for car crashes, divorces, broken bones. I don't want to be cursed, so I'm just gonna say, good Robert! Donna and Angie were student nurses and good friends who decided to room together while in school. And for Donna's 28th birthday, her mama gifted her a very large Raggedy Ann doll, something she was thrilled about. I'd be thrilled. Give me that next year. Soon after adopting the precious doll, Donna started to notice some weird behavior. So she would leave the doll on her bed every morning. She'd lock her bedroom door, seating her the same way with her arms and legs crossed, but she'd come home at night to Annabelle having moved rooms and being in positions that weren't possible. She described a couple of instances of the doll kneeling, and dolls that are stuffed cannot kneel unless it's like movable joints. Donna and Angie then started finding notes left throughout the apartment written on parchment paper and in red pen, two things they didn't own. When Donna's boyfriend Lou started criticizing the doll, unexplainable handprints and scratches began appearing on his body. And that's when the girls were like, hey, let's call a priest. And that priest brought in the Warrens. They were able to calm down the entity enough to remove it from the home and transport her to their museum where she resides to this day, unless of course their son-in-law keeps taking it out of the museum, and then that's a whole other conversation. And finally for today, this last legend states that Bodhidharma sat and meditated for so long that he became a round doll. During his travels, he stopped for a time in a monastery in China. He continued his journey until he decided to settle in a cave and meditate, and that's where our story began. The monk became a wall gazer. He meditated, eyes to the wall, in a seated position for 9 years. No breaks, no closing your eyes, maybe once after 7 years. And he was so furious at himself for what he perceived as lack of discipline that he got rid of his eyelids so that he would never do that again. As the eyelids touched the ground, they sprouted green tea plants. This legend is one of the reasons behind Buddhist monks often drinking green tea to stay awake. And on top of that, Bodhidharma also suffered the loss of his arms and legs as a consequence of his immobility for 9 years. Art and folklore depicting him show him almost exclusively displaying these characteristics, which is why the Daruma dolls symbolize the positions and features. And this doll is said to have been created by the Buddhist followers after his passing, and there's quite a few stories about it. I don't have all day, sadly, but we've got 15 years of backup for stories.
If you came across the demon-like creature with a long neck coming out of the well of a Himeji castle in Japan, would you be the same or check into an asylum? The Japanese royal castle itself dates back to 1333 and is regarded as one of the greatest remaining examples of Japanese castle architecture, as well as the Ghost of Okiku. What happened to her and why does she haunt the castle at night? Apparently the popular tale tells the story of her no longer as a human, but as a creature who lingers and crawls outside and around the castle. She was falsely accused of losing valuable dishes and was killed for it, and her ghost now haunts the castle as she counts the dishes in the kitchen in a mournful moaning tone. And once she reaches up to 9, she panics, shrieking violently as she throws herself into the well. Whatever threw Okiku in, I'm sure Countess Agnes of Berg, Germany castle would probably not go without a fight. Berg, Germany, it is said by their hosting tourist site that the castle is unlike other castles and it's been untouched by wars or sieges of violent country battles since its conception in 1157. In fact, the Elth family has been pretty privileged aristocrats and have been caring for the castle for nearly 900 years, from prestigious members and important figures in the Holy Royal Empire of the German nation. The family's 34th generational member, Johann Jacob, is now entrusted to protect the ancestral home. But what makes the castle haunted? Countess Agnes. Countess Agnes, as many of the rooms are closed off to the tourists, hers is especially closed off. But if you dare to trespass into her room, you might not be the same again. A breastplate and battle axe remains in her room still today, as the legend has it she died defending the castle from an unwanted suitor. May not have been a war, but she fought her home against a man trying to get her. Understandable. To this day, she haunts the castle from any unwanted men. But did the Countess die in her sleep trying to fight off her suitor, or did the suitor win? As for the legend of a young princess in East Scotland built in 1575 and 1636, lies an antique building known as the Castle Fraser, a famous elaborate architecture, beautiful fields of farmland and gardens. But according to legend, a young princess that was once staying at the castle was brutally killed in her sleep. Her body was dragged down the stone stairs, leaving trails and stains of her blood behind, and the staff and occupants tried hard as they tried to remove the stains, but were ordered instead to cover up the staircases with wood paneling, which remains as part of the interior design today. Some have even mentioned seeing the princess, and if you went home after, you'd wake up with her lying next to you. Oh my god. But what about the Bogard Castle in Denmark? 100% in the northeastern Danish town, a grand castle with many windows displayed the work of Raphael, Goya, and El Greco to the public, but with its dark past also paints a horrible picture. The tale of Ingeborg Skil, who was able to acquire the castle in 1578, drowned her own architect in the moat, preventing him from designing and making another castle, as hers was the only one worth building. Because of this rash and vile decision making, Ingeborg's ghost is now spotted and felt haunting throughout the castle, all dressed in white. Because they always are dressed in white for some reason. Even if you don't think she's there, you might feel the hair at the back of your neck rise as you pass by the Rosedonten, the Beauregard's castle's infamous dungeon. The dungeon was designed so that an adult man could neither stand up straight or lie down. It was possibly purposely designed to have no holes for light or air to enter. The question is, why did Skill ask the designer to have a dungeon in the castle in the first place, and what did she use it for? Sadly, when it comes to those who died an untimely death, it is all due to illnesses or natural causes, like for Kate, the daughter of William Lanarch, a prominent local politician in New Zealand. He had built the Lanarch Castle between 1871 and in 1887, where he served as a resident. He built the castle as a birthday present for his daughter Kate for her 21st birthday, but unfortunately, when she did turn 26, she died from typhoid fever. Her body may have left the world, but her spirit had certainly lingered, as she loved the ballroom her father built and had imagined herself spinning with friends and suitors. And if you peek inside, you might actually see a girl dancing by herself. Or it could just be me, I don't know. She also has been rumored to tap you on the shoulder and whispering in your ear, "Shall we dance?" When it comes to the dances of witches, it was very apparent in the Musham Castle of Austria, as the Salzburg witch trials had echoed the region between 1675 and 1690. Musham Castle had played a vital and unfitting role as a host to the many unjust executions, imprisonment, and the torment of hundreds and hundreds of both men and women, all accused of witchcraft and paganism. Although the witch trials died out and, like most humanity, needed another scapegoat or trend, they discovered in the late 1800s so many deer and cattle within the castle proximity found dead, and that the residents around were tried and killed for, can you guess? Being werewolves. Yeah. Today, visitors and staffs have reported hearing sounds of aggressive banging against the doors and walls, footprints that lead to closed-off spaces, and sheets of white mist floating through the halls, and even someone breathing onto the nape of your neck. Considering some of these castles were used to torment and hurt any victim that enters their halls, the same goes for the 13th century estate of the most haunted castle in Ireland, the O'Carroll family castle, also known as Leap Castle. Legend has it that there was an aggressive power struggle within the family in the 16th century. In a bit of war after the main patriarch died, a member of the family killed his own brother, who was also a priest. Visitors have noted seeing a disgruntled and heartbroken priest wandering within the bloody chapel of the home. Even as recent in 1990, when renovators found a secret dungeon in the chapel was filled with skeletons, dozens of skeletons of unknown victims who fell through a trap door through the castle. Traps that the O'Carroll prisoners would fall on top of wooden spikes and experience a slow and very painful death. A location that was close to the chapel where even visitors might even hear by an earshot. But like a pit of despair lies in some castles, maybe a pit of hell. In the Hosk Castle lies a huge hole in the ground that has been constantly rumored since its discovery, a gateway to hell. Why am I smiling? Some even say that the hole existed before the castle was built, and even the owners who created the Hosk Castle purposely made a deal with the devil inside and allowed the castle to be a front while evil deeds were made below. Even in some rhetoric after the ownership changed, some even tried to visit the hole somehow below, as some prisoners would bargain with the prison guards for their freedom. One man agreed that he would get to the bottom of the hole and report back in order to gain his freedom. When he was lowered, the prisoners and guards heard a sound from the man that was unheard of. Blood-curdling screams and panics of "Get me out! Get me out!" They pulled him back up to the surface only to see his face and body aged 30 years. All hair all white and face full of fear. Even with the fortress turned castles or castles turned into fortresses, there are no difference as the shady darkness that is lured within. Like the Arashs Fortress that was built in the late 1290s as the ultimate defense against foreign attacks and was instrumental in the 7 Years' War. The sprawling fortress is now used as some royal functions and can be toured by the public. However, locals say it's a war-torn past and has yet to leave, noting that some have seen the ghosts of soldiers roaming the halls. The most well-known supernatural sightings include a demon dog that is said to guard the gates of the castle, and a spirit of a woman that has no facial features. And finally, with one castle, Haunted Castle mentions a catchy motto which is "Live an interesting life." The Ballerina Castle, located in Ireland, was initially built by the Houdnet family. After many years and many witnesses of the battles, it was also used as an occupied and modified location for the Irish Army during the emergency to serve as a defense structure in 1939 to 1945. Mindful of its ghostly history, John, the previous owner of the castle, took precautions, inviting a local clergy to perform an exorcism on site and to bless the structure going forward. The history involving with the castle refers to Lady Margaret, who once walked through the castle looking for mirrors. She used to be a great beauty and had many suitors come line up. When she was forced to starve for a year from one suitor named Clon Rockenby, she finally lost her mind and her looks and smashed every mirror in the castle. Some witnesses say that her spirit had no face, while others say she would manifest wearing a veil to cover her sad and heartbroken face, looking for herself in mirrors. Number 10. Hanako-san. Killed in a raid, Hanako-san is a legendary manifestation turned into a demon lore that lurks in the bathrooms of school washrooms in Japan. Typically in the shape of a young schoolgirl, Hanako-san is known to want to play with someone or to drag you to hell through the toilet. Depending on which part of Japan you live in, she may have a bloody hand and grab you, or she will turn into a lizard and devour you. Like many urban legends, the detail of the origins of the legend depends on the account. Different versions of the story include that Hanako-san is a ghost of a girl who was killed while playing hide and seek during an air raid, or was killed by a parent or a stranger, or that she took her own life in a school bathroom. The legends of Hanako-san have achieved some popularity in Japanese primary schools, where children may challenge classmates to try and summon Hanako-san. Kind of similar to Bloody Mary if you ever tried playing that in elementary school. I know my classmates did. I wonder where they are now. Anyways, in a quick WikiHow, this is how you summon Hanako-san. Individuals must enter a girl's bathroom, usually on the 3rd floor of a school, knock 3 times on the 3rd stall, and ask if Hanako-san is present. If Hanako-san is there, she will reply with some variation of "Yes, I am." Depending on the story, the individual may then witness the appearance of a bloody or ghostly hand, or the hand itself, or Hanako-san herself, may pull the individual into the toilet, or may lead them into hell, or the individual might be eaten by a 3-headed lizard. Well, whatever happens, I hope you can come back on this channel and comment what the experience was like. But first, you gotta book a flight to Japan. Seems easy enough. Number 9. Tanzanian Island. An evil creature known as the Night Demon stalks the Tanzanian island of Pemba, located in the Indian Ocean. It can change shape as a bat sometimes, a human-like form at others, and it prefers to come out at night, but some say they have seen it during the day. The Popobawa batwing in Swahili is indiscriminate in its targets, but in a common retelling, the spirit targets men and physically harms them in a non-consensual way. The Night Demon story is rather new, only dating back a few decades from a time of civil unrest following the assassination of the country's president. The popular thinking goes that after a Papua attack, victims must spread the word to others on Pemba. Otherwise, they will continue to be visited by the Night Demon. Some men stay awake or sleeping in groups outside their homes, as the BBC reported in this 2007 article, as others have also smeared themselves in pig oil in hoping to repel the attacks. It kind of reminds me of that movie It Follows. You have to tell someone in order for it to go away. Number 8. Arashs Fortress in Oslo, Norway. Arashs Fortress was built in the late 1200s as the ultimate defense against foreign attacks, and it was instrumental in the 7 Years' War. The sprawling fortress is now used for some royal functions and can be toured by the public. However, locals say it's a war-torn past that has yet to leave, noting that some have seen ghosts of soldiers roaming the halls. The most well-known supernatural sighting includes a demon dog that has said to guard the gates of the castle, and a spirit of a woman with no facial features. Number 7. Come to Brazil. A legend known as Pesadilla originated in the country's southeast side of Brazil. This folklore is also known as a sleep paralysis demon, as it is also found in other regions with variant names. Pesadilla is also described as a crone with long fingernails who lurks on the roof at night and tramples on the chest of those who sleep on a full stomach with their belly up. This legend is mentioned in many anthropological accounts, as well as described an equivalent to Pesadilla for the native Brazilian indigenous, who would say she was an old woman who, along with her procession of unspeakable agonies would visit an individual. From what has been seen so far, it is possible to say that both the Piscitiera tale and sleep paralysis in general share many features such as malevolent supernatural presence, feeling of chest pressure, and difficulty breathing and to scream and sleeping in supine position with a full stomach. Number 6. Stul Cemetery. Located in the tiny, nearly forgotten Kansas town of Stul lays dormant the legendary gateway to hell, also known as the Stul Cemetery. The town the cemetery lives in is also the home to a number of legends and strange tales that are linked to the crumbling old church and the overgrown cemetery that can be found atop Stul's Emmanuel Hill. According to the stories made by university students at University of Kansas, state that Stul was haunted by legends of diabolical supernatural happenings, and the legends asserted that the cemetery was one of the 2 places on earth where the devil appears in person 2 times each year, so it visits in a tour. It says that the cemetery has been the source of many legends in the area. Stories have been told and retold for over a century. Like many other locations of this type, the tale of the devil worship and witchcraft also figured strongly into the article. The word also spreads that the spirit of those who died violent deaths were buried there and returned from the grave. Number 5. Black Forest Hunting, Colorado. Forests are typically thought to be serene and beautiful spots, and while most of them in Colorado are just that, there is one that is an exception to the rule: the Black Forest Haunting in Colorado. According to legend, the haunting began in 1991 after Coloradians Steve and Beth Lee purchased their dream home in the woods. Of course, that's always a good idea. Not long after buying the house, the couple began to experience strange occurrences, including unexplainable noises such as chains, loud orchestra music, and footsteps, foul odors, and flashing lights, prompting the couple to purchase an expensive security system. As if that wasn't frightening enough, during a cover on a TV show, both Beth and one of the show crew members were overtaken by a spirit during filming. This takes the Black Forest haunting to an entirely new level, as the crew members were shown violently crying on the ground while complaining of both numbness and the feeling of something entering her. There's even clips of this online if you want to check it out. The paranormal investigators speculate that Howard may have entered a rift in time-space sort of thing while trying to communicate with his still living father, or maybe he even contacted a demon waiting to be conjured on the other side. Number 4. Mexico. Although this legend spreads like wildfire throughout all of South America, the tale of La Llorona speaks of a woman who is in spit of rage after her lover dismisses her for another, ends up killing up her 2 children by drowning them in a nearby river. Stained with regret and pain, she was punished by heaven, telling her that she needs to find her children in order to come into the kingdom. So, as a condemned malevolent spirit, she is left to wander the world in perpetual grief, where she has become what we know as La Llorona. The people who have seen her have said that they can hear her walking soaking wet, wearing all white, and she can be heard crying out for the little ones she had killed. Ah, mijillo, she weeps, which means, oh my children. Some may have said that she snatches other young children as she walks, mistaking them for her own kids, and she knew. I knew someone from Nicaragua who mentioned that La Llorona also lurks there, and was told if they ever heard someone crying or wailing outside to not look no matter what. Because it could be the wailing woman looking for her kids, I mean similar reflections of this tale is also to the legendary Banshee in Ireland. But it seems in most cultures when it comes to the pain of women, that is when you should be the most terrified. Number 3. Isla de las Muñecas. Also known as the Islands of the Dolls, located in Mexico, this haunted location is not for the faint of heart, especially those afraid of dolls. Isla de las Muñecas in Mexico, aka Island of the Dolls, was never intended to be a tourist destination. Legends say a girl was found mysteriously drowned in the island by its caretaker Don Julian Santana Pereira. He found a doll nearby and assuming it was hers, he hung it to a tree as a way of showing respect, and he was apparently haunted by the spirit of the girl after that. And he started hanging more dolls in an attempt to please her. People say that the dolls are now possessed by her spirits, and some even say they hear the dolls whispering to each other. The tragedy of Don is when he died in the same spot he swore he found the doll, and some even say it wasn't even a little girl but a demon who trapped Don to live and dedicate his entire life to the island. Number 2. Poveglia Island. Venice, Italy has a lot of cool touristy spots, but one in particular is very jarring. The Poveglia Island was once used as a plague quarantine station and the location of a mental hospital. Venice's island has seen some dark days with a number of deaths and evil activities on the island. The site has attracted the attention of ghost hunters and paranormal investigators from all over. The island was sealed off and used to host people with infectious diseases, leading to legends of terminally ill Venetians waiting to die before their ghosts returned to haunt the island. A doctor allegedly experimented on patients with crude lobotomies. Because of the doctor's alleged torments, it manifested into malevolent spirits that invited other things sinister. Today, the mental hospital ruins remain, and the island is strictly off limits, but the local government has reportedly banned visitors. And finally, number 1. Aokigahara Forest. At our number 1, you might have seen before on other videos, to me is the Aokigahara Forest. This forest has a reputation as among the creepiest haunted places in Japan for a long time, as it was used to practice the ubatse, the practice of leaving old women to die in the forest, and that is said to have conjure their yuri, aka their soul, to haunt the woods. However, there is still also the assumption, because of the travesty and tragedy that accumulates in the twisted branches and disheartening nature of the forest, depends on the forest's association with demons in Japanese mythology. In Japanese folklore, certain places like crossroads, old temples, and abandoned buildings are thought to be haunted by malevolent spirits called yuri or oni. And although the forest attracts many visitors, the lives that has taken themselves here echoes in the pain and sadness that might attract these type of spirits. Again, it is always important to note that you are not alone, your life is always important, and if you know someone or you are someone who is struggling, know there are a ton of support out there, including me. Your impact in the world is just as important as the words you say, and it's not enough to desire change, we must actively work towards it. So please stay safe out there and know you are loved whether you believe it or not.